I'd like to turn now to the High Representative, Vice President of the Commission, Mr. Josep Borrell. Welcome to you, and Commissioner Lenarčič. I would like to call on the High Representative to take the floor.
Señor Presidente, señoras.
President, ladies and gentlemen, members, dear Commissioner Lenarčič, colleague, I've just returned from a 5-day mission to the countries of the Middle East, Arab countries and Palestine. There, I witnessed the high degree of emotion with which what's happening there is being followed by all. And it ought to be possible to have a debate on what is going on there without emotion and looking further beyond towards the building of peace. It is the case that on October the 7th, the world witnessed the greatest massacre of Jews that had ever occurred since the Second World War, and then witnessed the bombing of Gaza, defined by the United Nations, or described by the United Nations as an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, but not a natural catastrophe, not a natural disaster, but something that was brought about as a result of a blockade preventing essential supplies for the population's survival from getting through, which is another kind of massacre. Is there no interpretation, asks the speaker. Your English interpreter trusts that that can be heard.
We understand you in Spanish.
Stop a moment. Yes, please, you can continue. Voy a pedir tiempo de descuento.
I'm going to ask for extra time. President, I was saying that I'm just back from a 5-day trip to where this dramatic conflict is underway, and that we ought to be able to get over the degree of emotion that is overwhelming those involved. We ought to be able to look further towards a future of peace, because that ought to be possible because we are witnessing the greatest massacre or pogrom of Jews since the Second World War. We're seeing how the bombing in Gaza has caused an unprecedented disaster, not a natural one, but it's been brought about by man, by humankind, because the supply of basic provisions has been stopped. The United Nations described this as carnage. And it ought to be possible to recognize the right of Israel to defend itself and simultaneously to be indignant about what's happening, for us to be indignant about what's happening in Gaza to civilians. We ought to be able to defend the Israelis' right to have a state without that meaning we'd be criticized for being partisan. It ought to be possible to criticize the policies of Israel, because governmental or countries' policies can be criticized without one's being accused of not liking the Jews. Let's not jumble things up. One thing is to criticize a country, and a different thing is to express rejection for part of the population. But I'm also saying that what one sometimes sees, the expressions are of the ugliest side of the Jewish attitude doesn't help. When we describe them, it doesn't help the Palestinian cause. The International Court has begun investigations, and its chief prosecutor, Karen Kam, who I've been in touch with, are investigating what's going on and have sent very serious warnings to both parties, stating that Israel also has clear obligations in the context of the war that it's waging against Hamas not just moral obligations, but also legal obligations arising from the law on armed conflict and having to do with the prevention of access to basic supplies by the population, and that every school, every hospital, every church, every mosque is an area that's protected. And unless they lose that status as protected areas because they're being used for military purposes, then they need to be respected as such. And if there's any doubt as to whether a given territory or a given property has or has not lost its status as a protected place, the attacker has to assume that it's still protected by default or show proof that it has forfeited that status, and has to make it possible for the civilians there to leave. Similarly, indiscriminate rocket attacks by Hamas against Israel are also an infringement of international humanitarian law. And I was one of the earliest people to say that preventing access of water or access to water and electricity and staple supplies is an infringement of international humanitarian law, and the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is saying, it's not me, it's he is saying, and has told Israel that it should be making efforts without further delay to ensure the access of supplies and medicines and anesthetics on the part of the civilians. The European Union is extremely concerned about what's happening. And more specifically, we've expressed our concern about the attacks by Israeli settlers against civilians in the West Bank and elsewhere, and these are ongoing, and the prosecutor of the ICC has done the same. As you know, I represent the Council, and thus all member states. And you're also aware that it's not easy, because sometimes the member states have not spoken with a single voice. If you take, for example, the vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations, where 8 of our member states voted in favour of a humanitarian pause and 4 voted against, and the rest abstained. There is a joint position in the European Council which does speak in favour of pauses, plural, and humanitarian corridors, and requests that when Israel exercises her right to defend herself, it should do so in line with the international laws on war. But to date, different leaders in Europe have expressed different views on the way in which Israel is exercising that right to defense. And when there isn't a joint position, the High Representative can't express that joint position because it doesn't exist. But he has to go on working to see that it is built. He has to try to ensure that in future the member states can converge in such a way that they can bring some geopolitical pressure to bear, geopolitical influence to bear in this conflict. And this is what we're trying to do. Fully persuaded that there cannot be a military solution to this conflict. One cannot kill an idea. The only way is to get a better idea. And the better idea here can only be to recognize that when you have two peoples that have been fighting over the same land for more than 100 years, they need to be able to live together. If the international community is committed to that, and the international community has not yet been thus. In the 30 years since the Oslo agreements, we've been repeating two-state solution. The solution is 2 states. The solution is 2 states. We've repeated that, but we've done very little or nothing to bring it about. We thought that the idea that the problem could be compartmentalized, because one side was already peaceful and the other wasn't. But this drama that's exploded has shown us that there needs to be a peace not just between Palestine and Israel, but also between Israel and Palestine. And for that to be the case, all of us, notably we Europeans, need to become committed to getting over the huge grief and pain that these events, begun by Hamas's attacks beyond its borders in Gaza, brought about. This could be the opportunity for peace to be built, and this is what the European Union wishes to do. We have put forward proposals, 3 yeses, 3 nos. Gaza can't be under Hamas's control in the future. It can't be controlled by Israel in the future. It cannot be divided. 3 negatives, 3 positives. There has to be a Palestinian Authority in Gaza as well. The Israelis have to commit themselves not just to build finance construction, but we Europeans also need to be part of a solution that can only involve something that we've been expressing the need for years, which is peaceful coexistence between 2 peoples that are in conflict, which need to be able to share the same area, the same land in peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Borrell. Now, on behalf of the European Commission, Commissioner Lenarčič has the floor.
Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, distinguished High Representative Borrell, let me at the outset reiterate in the strongest terms our condemnation of the heinous attack by Hamas on Israel last month, and underline that Israel has the right to defend itself while respecting international law, in particular international humanitarian law. Also, as stated by President von der Leyen earlier today, we wholeheartedly welcome the agreement reached on the release of the 50 hostages and on a pause of hostilities. We stress, at the same time, the urgent need for all hostages to be released immediately, and we will work with our humanitarian partners to use the pause for a humanitarian surge in Gaza. Allow me to focus on 3 issues in my intervention: the humanitarian situation in Gaza, including the question of access into Gaza, the European Union's humanitarian response, and the outlook beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis. First, on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. There has been no let-up in the intense bombardment and fighting in Gaza. Casualty rates remain very high. At least 12,700 Palestinians are reported killed, including a very high proportion of women and children. 1.7 million people are displaced within Gaza. Thousands are currently on the move. We are seeing ongoing attacks on and fighting around medical facilities, which are protected under the international humanitarian law. There is an acute shortage across Gaza of all the most basic necessities: food, medicines, including anesthetics, water. According to the United Nations, food assistance currently covers only 10% of the minimum caloric intake. Medical facilities are either on the brink of collapse or have already shut down. Only 9 out of 35 hospitals in Gaza are reportedly still functioning, and this only partially. The toll on the United Nations and on aid and medical workers in Gaza has been appalling. At least 108 staff members of the UNRWA alone have been killed since the beginning of this crisis. Humanitarian access into Gaza remains extremely challenging. Over the last month, fewer than 50 trucks a day on average have been going into Gaza through the Rafah crossing from Egypt. This is woefully inadequate. And for several days last week, not a single truck was able to get in. The acute shortage of fuel in Gaza remains a major constraint. The agreement on 18 November by Israel to allow 120,000 liters of fuel for humanitarian operations is a step in the right direction, but will only cover 1/3 of the daily critical needs. Without fuel, trucks cannot move, and humanitarian actors cannot operate. Fuel is vital for hospitals, for clean water. It is needed for treatment of sewage to avert the looming public health crisis, and for mobile networks, without which no humanitarian assistance can be delivered inside Gaza. The amount of fuel available to humanitarian actors in any humanitarian crisis should depend on their needs and needs alone. Second, on EU response. As President von der Leyen announced, we have quadrupled our humanitarian funding for the occupied Palestinian territory to more than 100 million euros. This is being rolled out as we speak, supporting our accredited partners on the ground, the United Nations, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, and international non-governmental organizations. They are distributing food and water, maintaining emergency medical services where possible, helping with mass casualty management, ensuring basic hygiene, and so on. And we are continuously ramping up our European in-kind response. There have already been 15 EU humanitarian air bridge flights so far for Gaza, and more are in the pipeline. These are cargo flights for our humanitarian partners and for our member states. President von der Leyen was on the ground in Al Arish last weekend during the unloading of one of our flights. Most of the cargo from these flights has already gone into Gaza. We have moreover established a joint coordination cell with the Red Cross and Red Crescent to organize and channel our assistance. In parallel, we are helping the Egyptian Red Crescent further build up its logistical capacity. And through the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, we are supporting Egypt's frontline medical response. The key challenge, to repeat, is access for humanitarian assistance into Gaza. In the first instance, this means allowing a sufficient number of trucks into Gaza through Rafah, and if possible, opening another land crossing. But we should also explore all other possible avenues for allowing additional assistance into Gaza. Ensuring adequate humanitarian access will also require putting in place urgent and extended humanitarian pauses throughout Gaza and for a sufficient number of days, as called for last week by the United Nations Security Council in its resolution 2712, which was facilitated by Malta. We hope that the agreement on a pause of hostilities that has just been reached will allow for a substantial surge in humanitarian aid delivery into and within Gaza. And we certainly hope that this will not be a one-off. Third, on the prospects for Gaza and the broader Israeli-Palestine conflict, High Representative spoke about that already. Even as we respond to the immediate humanitarian challenges and do everything we can to promote respect for international humanitarian law, we need a step change in efforts to put work on a political solution to the conflict back on track. This means reinvigorating and accelerating efforts that have long been stalled towards a two-state solution, as the only way forward that can offer hope to both Palestinians and Israelis. More specifically, this will require working towards a solution for Gaza as an integral part of a solution to the broader Israeli-Palestinian issue, preventing any forcible displacement of Palestinians out of Gaza, preventing any return of Hamas to Gaza, as well as any long-term Israeli security presence in Gaza, urgently de-escalating the situation in the West Bank, and in particular, stopping the extremist settler violence, which has increased dramatically in recent weeks, and supporting a legitimate Palestinian Authority in administering Gaza. There is no alternative to engaging now if we are to break the spiral of violence, restore hope to people in Palestine and Israel, and prevent broader instability in the Middle East. Thank you.
Danke, Herr Kommissar.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We now move on to the speakers from our own assembly. We'll start with Ms. Raza Yukovinicini.
Dear colleagues, I have the feeling that we see the world too simplistically when we divide ourselves into either pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, and when many are repeating two-state solution. But this mantra will not work unless there is a fundamental agreement among Israel's neighbors that Hamas must not happen again, that the Jewish state has the right to exist. I was shocked when, after the bloody attack by Hamas, we saw the celebration in Gaza, and not only Gaza squares. As long as Hamas exists, it is difficult for me to believe in the success of the two-state solution. Hamas must be destroyed. That must be the task of the entire democratic community. Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda are the same cancer. They will be reborn again and again until the cause of the cancer is isolated, including terrorist states such as Iran or Russia. We have two wars of a similar nature in the both neighborhoods of European Union. Both are aimed at destroying democratic states, Israel and Ukraine. So many people are suffering. Europe's future, security, long-lasting peace depend on our response. The challenge is clear. Democracies must win.
Danke. Unser nächster Redner ist.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Pedro Marcos.
Thank you, Mr. President, High Representative, Commissioner, colleagues. As the sun rose today, a beam of hope came to Israel and Gaza. After weeks of indiscriminate bombing, a humanitarian truce was achieved last night. This must be the beginning of the end of the nightmare that started with the terror of Hamas and the death of more than 1,000 Israelis. But punishing the civilian population in Gaza was also not admissible. And it is not even effective. For peace is the only way to really eradicate the ideology of Hamas from Palestine and the region. Every one of the thousands of civilians that lost their lives in Gaza brought Israel not 1 millimeter closer to long-lasting peace. This bloodshed must end for good. A permanent ceasefire, the full release of the hostages is urgent and needed. We need a true political strategy with a viable political horizon. The far right in Israel has no permanent solution to this conflict. We as Europeans, we truly need to commit ourselves to the global effort of peace and the two-state solution. Thank you.
Danke, Frau Hill.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hilde Woutmans is the next speaker.
Dank u wel, meneer de voorzitter.
Thank you, President, ladies and gentlemen. So we woke up this morning with the best news we've heard this week. So finally, there's a temporary ceasefire and a promise of 50 hostages being released. So let this be the start of a longer-lasting ceasefire and the release of all hostages in this conflict that's already lasted far too long, because it is a genuine humanitarian disaster, ladies and gentlemen. The biggest murder of Jews since the Second World War, bombing schools and hospitals, 2 million people in Gaza who are looking for water, food, staples, medicines, safety, and then the hostages. Hell on earth, they call it, and this hell on earth has to be put a stop to. Mr. Borrell, you gave a clear message today. I think you were actually stronger than ever before in your statement on the conflict today, and I'd like to thank you very warmly for that. This is the Europe that I'm happy to see, rather than the cacophony that we saw at the start of the conflict, unfortunately. So I'm very pleased to see the power that you exuded today. And I'm proud, colleagues, of the visit of Mr. De Croo, the Prime Minister of Belgium. It shows to me, as a proud Belgian, how a small country can be great, because Belgium has played its role, colleagues, contrary to a number of other countries in the EU who are happy to have friendship links or worried about the past catching them up. But for me, this is a wake-up call for Europe. And here I'm turning to the Commission, because really this also shows our political weaknesses. You said 30 years have been a plea for the two-state solution, but we haven't done anything to bring that two-state solution any closer to reality. And when it comes to Europe, we haven't played a meaningful role. We've always had to look to the US and to Qatar. President, you let the Council and the Commission speak up beyond their time. As the main negotiator, I would like to be able to make my point. We find, colleagues, that Europe has to be reformed. If we want to be a geopolitical player, then I hope that you will agree to Kiefer Hofstadt's report soon in the vote that there should be a reform of Europe and that we'll be able to play a main role in these sort of conflicts. Thank you.
Herr Jordi Solé.
Mr. Jordi Solé.
Hoy vemos un pequeño rayo de...
Today we see a small ray of light after 50 days of darkness, of war and of death. The 4-day truce is welcome with the release of hostages. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. We need a permanent ceasefire and the release of all hostages, as well as an increase in humanitarian aid. After the abominable actions of Hamas on the 7th of October, Israel had to respond. But the Israeli military response against Hamas did not have to turn into a war on the civilians of Gaza. The response has been an indiscriminate, disproportionate response in an area in the Gaza Strip where 1 in every 10 people has been assassinated. These are innocent civilians, many of them are children. This has already become the most deadly conflict for children of recent decades. International law and international humanitarian law sets out standards that have to be respected. To respect the human being, and that this goes for all wars. After this terrible war, we will have to try to heal these awful wounds, but also this interminable conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians that has gone on for so long. We have seen the conflict management that so many people thought were the solution has brought us. No level of violence is sustainable because conflicts will always use this violence. We want to see Gaza without Hamas, but without a blockade and without occupation. We need to see a legitimate, effective government that the people can accept as their own. Gaza has to be part of the solution for all of the occupied Palestinian territories and will also mean more security for Israel. Thank you.
Mr. Herman Terch has the floor now.
Buenos días, gracias.
Good morning. Thank you. Golda Meir stated that the war in Palestine and in Israel would end when the Palestinians love their children more than they hate the Israelis. That's not happened yet. It's a long way off. It has to be said also that we cooperated because we have financed books in the occupied territories that only foster hatred of Israel and foster the whole culture of systematic terrorism. In Gaza, there was enthusiastic applause for what happened on the 7th of October, and in the occupied territories, it was also applauded. Palestine's authorities, who are being presented here as being wonderful, are still continuing with this attitude when people are being killed. So therefore, Israel has a right to end this war by ending Hamas once and forever, by putting an end to it once and for all. Some people don't want this, apparently, here to see this happen. It is going to happen. We're sorry about, we regret all of the deaths, all of the disasters, but this is what's got to happen. Hamas has to be put an end to, and Israel needs to provide its own guarantees because we're not providing them.
Grazie, Presidente. Beh, ho sentito...
Thank you, President. I've heard a lot of colleagues ask why, once again, Europe is irrelevant on a topic of foreign policy. We've seen the positions adopted by the various European institutions since the 7th of October, not just in the Council, but also the other authorities have expressed differing positions, and there have been personal spats arising far too often in recent weeks. This is not because of nationalism, but because of personalities, about people who put their own political careers above shared interests. Now, of course, we welcome the news that some of the hostages will soon be released, but if you want to really understand what's happening and what this chamber should do, you have to understand what happened on the 7th of October and what's going on in that region, because the events of the 7th of October was not the cry of a people demanding their own sovereignty. It was a terrorist act perpetrated by a organization that attacked a state, because that's written into Hamas's statutes. And that's what Hamas does, working with its supporters, including Iran. And if you can't understand that, then you won't be able to understand the concrete solutions that will help us move forward, and you won't be able to understand the support that this chamber, these institutions, should show to Israel, who live under the constant threat of destruction. It's the left, their short-sightedness mean that this topic always is an own goal. You work for minorities, for LGBT, for women, and yet at the same time you're supporting Islamist fundamentalism, which denies rights to women, which condemns homosexuals to death, and which cracks down on freedom. Thank you.
The next speaker is Madame Aubry.
Chers collègues,
Colleagues, this morning we're letting out a breath of the first time for being able to at least relax somewhat, seeing that people are going to be released, they're going to be able to rejoin their nearest and dearest, and we have to carry on doing our utmost to release the rest of the hostages. Gaza's been under these bombs for many weeks now, and they're hoping that this will soon stop, because the death counts is counting up, and yes, people are refusing to condemn this. 14,000 people have been killed, including thousands of women and children, and you've sanctioned that. You've sanctioned bombs on hospitals and schools. You've said nothing about those crimes, but you're always against a ceasefire, because a ceasefire can't just be a pause. It has to be a longer-lasting ceasefire. How do we tell these thousands of parents who've lost their children that they're collateral damage, that we shouldn't enter into a ceasefire with Israel? We should look at the second package of sanctions against Russia, but how at the same time can we see that nothing is being done against the war crimes against Gaza by Israel? This is unacceptable, and there have to be consequences in Gaza, but also on the West Bank, that we don't talk about very much, where the crackdown is getting worse and worse. The settlements seem to have no limits. Every day, the Palestinians are attacked and abused and beaten and chased off their territory. It's a form of ethnic cleansing. Every Palestinian village counts, so we must do something. And we have to have a diplomatic solution, because this can only stop once we have a two-state solution. We need to look at what's happening in the Middle East, because it will have ramifications around the world. And today we're at a tipping point. If the European Parliament continues in being blind to what's going on, it's not just covering itself in shame, but it will bury permanently international law, and with it the hope of a lasting peace. Thank you.
Frau Sabrina Pignedoli.
Ms. Sabrina Pignedoli.
buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning. Gaza is hell on earth. There's no water, food, medicine. Newborns die in intensive care because there's no electricity. Schools are bombed, as are ambulances and hospitals. In just a month and a half, over 5,000 children have been killed, as well as 200 doctors and nurses, over 60 media workers, and over 100 UN staff. It is a bloodbath. What else has to happen before we say enough is enough? We condemned the Hamas criminals, and today we must similarly condemn the criminals of Netanyahu and his army. Europe supports the UN, Secretary-General Guterres, in their attempt to put an end to this massacre. I would like to thank the High Representative Josep Borrell for everything that you're doing. But the European Union is conspicuous by its absence. We have a large amount of responsibility for what's happening because of our inertia. Let's do some real diplomacy. We have to recognise the state of Palestine and put an end to economic relations with anyone who kills civilians. Tolerating the annihilation of a people means that we are complicit in violations of their human rights. Thank you.
Nun hat Herr Michael Gahler.
Mr. Michael Gahler has the floor now. Thank you, President, ladies and gentlemen. From the outset, as the Parliament, we wanted to have and we demand the unrestricted release of the hostages, but now 50 are going to be released on the basis that 150 Palestinian prisoners will be released at the same time. There'll be a 4-day ceasefire. I'm happy for the families of those hostages being released. What's regrettable is that in the perception of many Palestinians and Arabs, it seems to be Hamas who's managed to force the Israelis into these concessions, and that the lengthy peace solution has not come about because Palestine hasn't been able to talk to Israel and accept that they have the right to exist. So we as Europeans should have coordinated our responses there with the US. So we had a robust mandate for Gaza, where there be a strong international presence, first of all for humanitarian aid, but then for reconstruction in Gaza. That's something that then has to lead to a process, a peace process, where there be elections that take place and negotiations for a peace, a lasting peace. I'm in favour of Gaza not being allowed to be repeated, and we don't see a further intifada in the West Bank because it has to come. We have to come to a genuine peace process.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. High Representative, Mr. Commissioner. First of all, I would like to commend your statements and personal efforts since the crisis escalated. The role of the European Union in this crisis could have enormous importance for our global role, our relations with the Middle Eastern countries and other global partners. The EU must be more engaged, but the neighbouring countries should also assist more in mitigating the effects of this humanitarian disaster. Of course, Israel has a right to defend himself, targeting terrorists from Hamas, but the way it does must be regarded through a clear set of rules that are internationally recognized. Depriving civilians of essential commodities to survive can't be justified, especially if more than half of civilian victims are children. The exchange of hostages and temporary ceasefire are the first positive steps, but many more are needed to accomplish a sovereign Palestinian state that is in peace with the State of Israel, a goal that we must continue pursuing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Frau Vizepräsidentin Nicola Beer.
Now our Vice President Nicola Beer has the floor.
President,
with all the justified concerns to resolve the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and to help the civilian victims, we shouldn't forget what has happened. The trigger for this situation was Hamas. Every day Hamas is firing rockets at Israeli civilians, and they're using humanitarian shields in Gaza. It's up to Hamas to stop the horror and to start the peace, and the liberation of all hostages must be a prerequisite for that. But a real peace has to end Hamas's terror. Would it be out of this world to think that the Palestinians and the Israelis could do this together, that we could have leading personalities involved who could understand the pain of loss, who could then push to stop this conflict? believing that politicians are going to see beyond a power struggle and work for a peaceful coexistence in the future. Is that too much to ask? This is something we managed to do after the Second World War. We need a new Oslo moment, and we as the EU should do everything to support it.
Danke.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Grace O'Sullivan.
People all over the world are asking, what can we do to stop a war that has taken 5,000 children from their mothers and has left an entire generation traumatized, while the families of hostages now hold their breath to hear if loved ones will be released. EU leaders have entirely failed to give an answer to that question. What can we do? You have failed to call for a ceasefire. You have failed to react to breaches of international law. Gaza is in ruins while settlements in the West Bank continue to expand. Netanyahu and his far-right government are emboldened by your silence. And so others must provide the answers where you have failed. Here's what you can do. Demand a permanent ceasefire now. End trade settlements. End trade with settlements now. Recognise the Palestinian state now. The EU must be courageous, not complicit. Thank you.
Frau Asita Kanko.
Ms. Asita Kanko.
President, today I have a question, a pressing question for some Western feminists. How can you remain silent when women and girls are raped, tortured, their bodies carried around naked and spat on by bearded men shouting Allah Akbar? Then you can never call yourself a feminist again. Every day, including today, some Western hypocritical feminists should be ashamed of their silence on the horror that Hamas men inflicted to women and girls on 7 October. And that includes big names we were once proud of. Why are their lips sealed and their hearts of stone when it comes to the excruciating pain of Jewish women? The Me Too movement and so-called intersectional feminists do not care about all women. If they remain silent, it means they have lied to us about their commitment to women's rights. Their actions support the oppressor, not the victims. Also, the EU money does, indirectly. Those who say nothing about these women and the hostages should not be standing here and speaking about human rights. When you are under attack by terrorists, a ceasefire is like raising your hands when you are being shot at. Perhaps it's worth considering that a real lasting ceasefire will start with bringing back all the hostages to their homes and the rapists to justice.
Now you are on the speakers list. Our next speaker is Mr. Anders Vistisen.
This discussion is always very sensitive. I don't think there's anybody in this chamber who feels that civilian deaths are not, they shouldn't happen at all. If they can be avoided, they must be avoided. But the rhetoric is a bit sort of strange here. If the UN's Secretary General says that we are witnesses to the biggest loss of civilians, it's unparalleled. It hasn't happened in my time as Secretary General, he said. But let's remind each other and him that while he's been the Secretary General, the conflict in Syria is still going on. 500,000 people have died there. In Yemen, the conflict has not been solved. 377,000 deaths. Afghanistan, 176,000 dead. Darfur, 300,000 dead. Iraq, 400,000 dead. And Congo, more than 660,000 people died there. So, there is a striking difference between when Muslims kill Muslims and Arabs kill Arabs, and when Israelis try and fight Hamas. When you listen to the rhetoric in this House and the rhetoric you hear from the United Nations, let's bear in mind that When you ask Palestinians, both in Gaza and on the West Bank, if they supported the terrorist attack in October, 3 out of 4 says, yes, we support that. But Israel has a right to defend itself. We have the right to fight Islamic terrorism, and we must do it until we've won the fight. Thank you.
Herr Manu Pineda, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Mr. Borrell, last Monday, this Parliament refused not just to ask for a ceasefire, but to even debate it. There are now 14,128 people have been murdered by Israel in Gaza Strip, more than 5,000 children, more than 3,000 women. 6,000 people have been buried by ruins on the Gaza Strip. Just in the first 3 weeks of this genocide, there were more children who died in Gaza than in the whole of last year in conflicts in the world. How many more Palestinian children have to be murdered by Israeli bombs for this European Parliament and the European Union to ask for a ceasefire? If we talk about hostages, let us require that the 240 Israelis held by the Palestinians be released, and also the 7,000 Palestinians who are being held in Israeli prisons. Or are some of them more painful to us than these? Of those 7,000, more than 800 are women and children in Israeli prisons. If we really want peace, let us listen to our peoples. Our peoples are in the street making the case for what we're refusing to press for, starting with a ceasefire, a permanent, fair ceasefire, not just a pause. Secondly, that we should take steps. We should take action rather than just speak words. We should go beyond these words, deeply concerned in English, and do something to put an end to the occupation. And thirdly, we should support the initiatives so that Netanyahu and all of those who are responsible should be. The speaker is unfortunately cut off.
Unser nächster Redner ist Herr Kostas.
The next speaker is Mr. Kostas Papadakis.
Κύριε Μπορέλ, δεν χρειάζεται πτυχίο
Mr. Borrell, you don't need to be a lawyer to know that the barbaric actions of Israel in Gaza are heinous crimes. They're bombing hospitals, and we hear fake news that the Israeli army saying that they have to defend themselves. But it seems that the object of their attacks is not Hamas, but to avoid the foundation of a Palestinian state. We're seeing that energy companies are going to be taking over contracts there, and we condemn what the various states are bringing about there. For example, the Greek state. We don't want the Palestinian people to be massacred. Many Palestinians are trying to assert the rights of their Palestinian people, and they're demanding a Palestinian state with Southeast Jerusalem as a capital. Thank you.
Lopez is the resweit.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. The 19th of October, there was a huge majority in the European Parliament to adopt a resolution which condemned the Hamas attacks and regretted the suffering of the Palestinian people being used as a human shield for Hamas. But there were 20 votes against this resolution. Of course, it's a very small minority. Two of them were from former Spanish ministers. Now, we've heard that it's very hard to reach agreements within the Council. But Of course it is, if these two ministers in the Spanish government. Now, we have the president of the Commission who've also launched financial funds that are supposed to provide aid. But if we look at the history of Europe, we've been discussing this for the last 2 weeks, but when we have to have resolutions, okay, but what about financial aid, European presence? It was the Americans who managed to bring about this pause, this humanitarian pause. Where were we? Well, of course, how can you be surprised we were absent when we see what's in the council?
Frau Insier, Evin, the floor is yours.
Ms. Evin Inche has the floor. Colleagues, a small area in the Middle East cut off from the surrounding areas where none of the civilian population are being bombed, can find shelter. Care workers, children, women are all being attacked here. Gaza is being considered as the world's biggest outdoor prison. The screeches for peace are being heard across the world, here in the parliament as well. In the Swedish right wing, the SD, but also the Conservative Party, seem to be deaf because of their enmity towards the Palestinian people. We have to fight Hamas, but we have to at the same time make sure that innocent Palestinians and Israelis are protected and that Palestinians aren't forced out of their homes. Yesterday's agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis is important, but let's not forget the rules of war have to be respected by all parties at all time. The EU has to contribute with humanitarian aid, support the Palestinian Authority, stop the suffering, and push for a permanent two-state solution so Palestine is recognized as a state so that Palestine and Israel can be in peace.
VP Borrell and Commissioner Lenarčič for your important work. But I also must say that I'm ashamed of Commissioner Varhelyi and his actions. Thank you.
Monsieur Bernard Guetta, the floor is yours.
Dans nos 27 capitales,
in our 27 capital cities and in Washington and all other countries of the Arab League, the talk is all about the two states, Israeli and Palestine states. Many people don't want to believe it, but Palestine will actually come into being alongside the state of Israel for the simple reason that there's no other possibility for this 100-year war. But who, people ask, will expel the 500,000 settlers? Well, a minority will put up futile resistance. Most of them will go back to Israel, and others will become foreign residents in this new state. That's not the real problem. The real problem is that reason, good sense, doesn't have enough defenders on either side of this, and that's why peace, just and lasting peace, will have to be imposed from the outside, just as the partition of 1947 was imposed by the United Nations. Then our union will have a fundamental role to play. So rather than arguing about words, truce or ceasefire, our parliament should be preparing urgently, fully for that role when peace breaks out. Thank you.
Ms. Hannah Neumann has the floor.
As we debate, families in Israel are mourning children, parents, spouses barbarically killed by Hamas terrorists on October 7. They fear for the lives of hostages, and they are seeking shelter from ongoing Hamas shelling. In Gaza, people are mourning their children, parents, spouses who have become victims of Israel's shelling of civilian infrastructure. They fear for those who remain exposed to ongoing airstrikes and suffer under the siege of Gaza. All human beings have the right to live in safety and freedom. Demanding this for one group does not question this right in relation to another group. Empathy is not a zero-sum game. The announced release of hostages linked to a temporary truce offers a new glimpse of hope to end the spiral of violence. The European Union, together with the UN, Arab states, and the US, must facilitate a process where both Israelis and Palestinians can work on solutions to live side by side in peace, hopefully for good this time.
Der nächste Redner ist Herr.
Next speaker is Mr. Fragos.
Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ, κύριε Πρόεδρε.
Thank you, President. Without a doubt, those responsible for the situation in Gaza are the United States, who finance the Taliban in Afghanistan, and also Hamas, to try to damage Fatah and Arafat. Another key person responsible is Erdogan, who did not hesitate to support the terrorist organization Hamas. So we here, Mr. Borrell, ask ourselves, how can the European Union talk about and finance this dictator, Erdogan? The European Union should not accept any Muslim extremists on their own territory. Not even the Arab countries do that. It's shameful to talk about this. We should not be accepting any illegal migrants onto our territory.
Simniok, Sie sind am Wort.
Mr. Timniok, you have the floor. President, neither in the course of war nor during the release of hostages during this conflict have we had any impact. The EU is left to one side. In political terms, it's not even an extra in this film. It would be more important to have a debate here in this House to talk about the consequences in Europe would have to be drawn. The anti-Semitic demonstrations of the overwhelming Muslim mobs on our streets should be a wake-up call. There's urgent need to act to stop Islamization in Europe. But following these demonstrations of power, what's happened? Were Islamists deported? Were organizations banned? Were illegal migrants rejected? Nothing of that sort. In Germany, we're seeing Taliban officials enter our state without the knowledge of the authorities to spread hate. How long are we going to stand and watch? Are we going to wait until we're overrun? We have to combat Islamization before it's too late. Let's concentrate on what we can do and not just on our pipe dreams.
Nun ist Herr Miroslav.
Mr. Miroslav Radoskovsky has the floor.
Kolegyně, kolegovia.
Colleagues, attitude of us Europeans towards the Jewish nation is not honest and hypocritical. During centuries, we have liquidated a Jewish nation. There was Holocaust. We killed 6 million innocent Jews. We were not able to live together with them. We created a state for them. And because we were unable to live with them, we told Palestinians, you must live with them. You must live with them, but not under similar conditions, not as equals. Israelis got their own state, Palestinians, Gaza Strip, Western Bank of Jordan, occupied territory, without a capital, without a vision for future. And this is the main reason why we are witnessing what is happening today in the Middle East. And I repeat what I said 2 weeks ago. Nobody will be able to destroy Jewish nation, but nobody will be able to destroy Palestinian nation. Let us start talk about peace. Let us ask for the creation of a Palestinian state. That's the future. Thank you very much.
Das Wort gebeten hat Herr Halicki.
Mr. Halicki has the floor.
Dear colleagues, I would like to emphasize the dramatic situation of children in Palestine. We cannot be blind. 5,000 kids were killed. 700,000 are displaced because their houses are destroyed. Thousands are injured. There is lack of water, electricity. Children have to be protected. But this is not the only situation in Gaza Strip. In West Bank territory, 11-year-old girl was sentenced to prison on 12 years This is cruelty. We have to protect children. We cannot accept it. As European Parliament, we have to react, and I call European institutions to act and to react. Children are innocent, and there is no black and white scenario. The war is not a solution. We have to protect kids, children, hospitals, schools have to be protected. Stop this war. Thank you.
Thank you. Frau Elena Joncheva, the floor is yours.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président, chers collègues.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is unsupportable as more than 900,000 people have been displaced who need to be put up by the United Nations. There are 17 facilities that are directly affected by the conflict, so this is appalling. Instead of discussing ways in which further conditions should be laid on the provision of aid, the EU should be bringing pressure to for more humanitarian corridors so as to relieve the situation in Gaza. The conflict goes beyond the borders of Israel and Gaza right now. There's been a cargo that has been hijacked in Yemen, and there are Romanian and Bulgarian crew members involved. What measures do you plan to take, Mr. Borrell and others, to ensure that the people on that vessel can be freed? What measures are you planning to take? Thank you.
Rodriguez Ramos, am Wort.
Rodriguez Ramos.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. A ray of hope today with the freeing of Israeli hostages and a 4-day ceasefire. But we all know that this is far from being enough. What's happening in Gaza is appalling. Gaza is now a grave with more than 16,000 bodies in it, and we are not doing enough to prevent this humanitarian catastrophe. The EU would not allow any other country to infringe the basic provisions of international law, the protection of civilians, the protection of humanitarian personnel, protection of the press, banning attacks on hospitals. International humanitarian law and its fulfillment is what separates democratic countries from autocratic countries and from terrorist organizations. So our double standards here when it comes to the defense of human rights and the defense of international law here is intolerable. And this is something that we're going to have to pay the bill for later on when it comes to this ultimate solution, which is a two-state solution.
Thank you, Mr. Muniz Hattori.
Merci, Monsieur Borrell.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Borrell. Given the cacophony and lack of responsibility, you have been able to make your voice heard, and I would like to welcome two pieces of news. Possible hostage release. This is very good news and is encouraging when it comes to a sustainable, long-lasting ceasefire. And the proof that we have never financed Hamas. Commissioner Borrell, who tried to blame the European Union and should leave. It's a question of the honour of the EU. It has to be clear in the world that we support peace, stability, international law. We promote human rights. That's our job. That's our role. So we have to demand this. We have the means to achieve that. We are the first economic and trade partners of Israel and finance the Palestinian Authority. We have the tools. We have to activate our sanctions regime against anyone who attack human rights, and we have to demand a sustainable, peaceful solution. 2 states, that's the only way we're going to see stability in the world. Thank you.
Herr Bert-Jan Reussen.
Bert-Jan Reussen, you have the floor.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, President, High Representative, Commissioner. To all of those who believe that criticism is to be levelled at Israel, including Mr. Borrell, I'd like to put the following question. Who has been holding more than 200 innocent citizens as hostage for more than a month? Yes, Hamas. Who on the 7th of October spread death and destruction on a peaceful music festival and several kibbutzes? Exactly, Hamas. And who is using innocent citizens as a human shield? Exactly, Hamas. I'm sure everything needs to be done to try and release all hostages as soon as possible. We've seen the terror and misery in the eyes of their relatives who have terrible stories to tell. But there seems to be an agreement on a release of a first group of hostages, and that's promising. But let's not forget that in order to have a lasting peace, Hamas has to be taken out of operation. Israel deserves our support.
Ich erteile Herrn Dino.
Bambini morti.
Dead children by indiscriminate attacks. Men, women, civilians killed just because they're Palestinian. Including newborns dying in incubators because they've switched off electricity to hospitals. That's what's going on in Palestine. This is all the responsibility of Netanyahu. I, in this chamber, have asked Europe to condemn these violations of human rights, this terror, and nothing's happened. We rightly condemned the terrorist attack by Hamas and the acts of war from Putin's Russia. But why are we waiting to condemn Netanyahu's criminal behavior? It's shameful to accuse people of anti-Semitism when they criticize this Israeli government. There are Israelis around the world speaking out about Netanyahu's crimes. What is Europe doing? What about those children whose family members have died who are without heating? Are we going to tolerate these violations of human rights? No. Palestinian children are being killed by Netanyahu's choices, and we have to take a position now. Otherwise, we are guilty of dirty hypocrisy.
Nun ist Miss Anna Michelle
Ms. Anna Michelle Asimakopoulou has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bring them back home. That was the desperate cry of the families of the hostages that were brutally abducted by the terrorist organization Hamas when it launched its heinous attack on Israel on October 7th. Today, it appears 50 hostages are going to be released as part of a deal that includes the release of 150 Palestinian prisoners in a 4-day humanitarian pause. And of course, we welcome this development and hope it leads to more positive developments. Israel has indicated its willingness to continue to discuss the humanitarian pauses in exchange for release of the hostages. Today, I would like us not to forget that there are another 200 families that are desperate at this moment, that are in excruciating pain, that are wondering about their loved ones. And to them, I would like to say that bring them home means bring them all back home. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Nacho Sanchez Amor, the floor is yours.
Agradecerle su impecable posición política.
I'd like to thank you for your impeccable political position, but also your diplomatic position, Mr. Borrell, in the face of the situation. I'm afraid that the Commission started in a very poor fashion. The damage was done by the Commissioner Van Helle at the outset, and today they've simply described the situation. But Mr. Borrell, I wish to warn you and your colleagues about the dangers that we're running when we allow people to say that the EU has double standards in the face of local recent conflicts. In some cases, this is the case, in others it's not. But there's a danger that our soft power be taken away. We have our principles, we have our values, and we can't allow ourselves to give the world this dangerous image of moral inconsistency by having differing approaches to different military conflicts. With preventive excuses, so far as this chamber is concerned, our guide is respect for international law without any preferences and without any exceptions. And we are as concerned and regretful about the dead, be they Israeli or Palestine.
Aujourd'hui, le Proche-Orient tout entier.
Today, the whole of the Middle East is being held hostage. Of course, I'm thinking about the 237 hostages being held by Hamas. All the men, women, all the children, they should all be allowed to go home. But I'm also thinking of the 2 million Gazans. They're also being held hostage by Hamas. It's us, Europeans, who are concerned about their fate and who are in the first place when it comes to giving aid to the Palestinians. Hamas is building tunnels, not schools. They buy arms, not medicines. They don't help the Palestinian cause. They use it for personal gain and to fuel their insane anti-Semitic Islamist plans. And I'm thinking about peace that was sketched out in the Oslo Accords and whose craftsmen are now dead. Arafat is gone, and in Palestine now, who has his courage to fight for peace? Rabin was assassinated. Today, the Israeli extremists encourage Israeli settlers to go after Palestinians in the West Bank. They have no design for a future for Gaza in the future apart from destruction. They have betrayed Rabin and taken peace hostage. We Europeans know what Islamist terrorism is, and we express our solidarity with the Israeli people. We Europeans know and understand the suffering of the Palestinian people, and I would like to thank you, Commissioner Lenarčič, for your bold positions and for your relentless efforts. You do us an honour. It's the Israelis and Palestinians who have to work together to build peace together. The speaker has been cut off.
Come to the end. Our next speaker is Mr. Teuvo Hakkarainen.
Thank you, President. What if your home were destroyed? Rockets would be sent and so on. What would you do? Would you take counteraction? Of course you would. Or you would release your home to the enemies. Jews are being attacked all the time, every day. Can we even start negotiations? Hamas says that every Jew should be abolished from the world. On this basis, we cannot expect peace with these people in Hamas. Gaza population is taken hostage by Hamas. Hamas holds every Palestinian person hostage. And now the European Union has funded Palestinians, but actually all this money has gone to Hamas terrorists. They've built tunnels underneath hospitals and other civilian infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioners. I want to talk about hostages. I want to talk about the over 200 Israeli women, children, and men whom Hamas kidnapped on October 7th. And I want to talk about the Palestinians in Gaza whom Hamas has taken hostage to. And while I welcome the positive news about a possible deal, it is still vital to stress that Hamas must release all hostages. All hostages. The vicious terror organization Hamas, set on annihilating the state of Israel, has butchered Israelis, raped women in front of their children, burned humans alive. But Hamas is also tormenting Palestinians in Gaza, blocking their escape, using them as human shields, refusing basic rights, torturing people for being gay, silencing women. Hamas leaves no hope for the future of Gaza and for the people of Gaza that they claim to represent. Hamas must be defeated. From the river to the sea, all hostages must be free. Thank you.
Thank you. Nun hat unser Kollege Udo.
Now, Udo Bullmann has the floor.
Herr Präsident!
President, ladies and gentlemen, if we can get hostages liberated, if we can have ceasefires which hold, then these are important and correct steps to take, but it's insufficient in and of itself. The people in the death zone of Israel, the people in the death zone of Gaza need more than that. And yes, Mr. Borrell's correct. We have to look towards peace. But what does that mean? That means for the European Union that we have to have the strength and courage to take that path. People in Israel have to be able to live in peace and safety. Where are the representatives of the Arab neighboring states to help guarantee that? Where are the friends of Israel who make it abundantly clear that no more innocent people may die and that violence must be stopped? Commissioner, High Representative, let's be part of the solution. Let us be part of the solution that stops this spiral of death once and for all.
Okay. No.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Lucas Mandel has the floor. Thank you very much, Vice President Otmar Karas, High Representative. Yes, there has to be a ceasefire. All the organizations like the Islamic Guard, Hamas, Hezbollah, all these Iranian-funded organizations have to be stopped. They have to be stopped in the EU as well. If we can stop that violence, there will be no more Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. But we in the European Parliament, we're here in our comfy seats and we can decide when the right time is for a truce and for the release of hostages. No, we can't decide that. It's the Israeli soldiers, our representative partners there, the Israeli government. But some may never return, and that's more than 1,000 women, children and men who've been killed by this Islamic attack. They're never going to return home. So I'd call Muslims to distance themselves from the anti-Semitism that we're seeing clawing its way back into Europe, and it should be fought with the utmost harsh application of laws, and those who are responsible for the 7th of October attacks must be brought to justice. The next speaker is Ms. Isabel Santos.
High Representative, Commissioner, I'd like to begin by expressing gratitude for the clear-sightedness, the firmness, the determination that's been shown at times when there's been a sort of cacophony in general, which threatened our having a reasonable view on the Middle East. I was in touch with an NGO that stated our teams that we have in Palestine are exhausted. They're beyond hope. We're having children who are being operated on and having limbs amputated without anesthetic on the floor of hospitals. When you hear that, there's not much more that needs saying. The right of Israel to defend itself against Hamas's attacks is legitimate if it's thoroughly bracketed, limited by international law. It's enough already of insincere words. We have hopes about truces and so on, but it's not enough. The EU needs to be committed to ensuring the end of violence in the West Bank as well. This is the only way to ensure peace. Thank you.
is Mr. Alexandrov Yordanov.
Mr. President, Mr. Borrell, let us commend Israel for its efforts to have the hostages released. But it should be clear that as long as Hamas exists, the humanitarian disaster will continue and there will be no peace. There is one single solution: destruction of Hamas, Hezbollah, and all other terrorist organizations in the region. As to the civilian population in Gaza, obviously, it is not that peaceful when males become terrorists. That population supports Hamas. We need further sanctions against the countries that support terrorism, mainly Iran, but also Russia. There should be peace and Palestinian state when there is no Palestinian terrorism any longer. Free Palestine means Hamas-free Palestine. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much.
Grazie, Presidente, signora.
Thank you, President. High Representative. There are negotiations underway and they seem to be leading to a possible truce and hostage release. We hope that this happens as quickly as possible. So this leaves room for a bit of optimism, but also we have to see that there is a tragic situation on the ground. Over a month after the criminal attacks by Hamas, we're seeing an increase in the deaths in Gaza. They do not have basic commodities, fuel, food, medicines. This is a tragic situation, and you yourself, High Representative, I think rightly set out the path we have to follow. We need to see an immediate end to hostilities to ensure that humanitarian aid can get into Gaza. It should not be reoccupied by Israel. We don't want to see forced expulsion of Palestinians. I'll repeat what I've already said in this chamber. Israel has a right to defend itself, but not to enact revenge. Civilians have to be protected. We've shown that the European Union can speak with our own voice and play a diplomatic role. We have to continue to do this, and we can't wait. We need to see an end to this war.
Danke.
Thank you.
Mr. Lucas Folla.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε, κύριε Επίτροπε, κύριε Μπορέλ, οι εξελίξεις...
President, Commissioner, Mr. Borrell, the developments in Gaza and the ceasefire, the truce that's been called for now, gives a glimmer of hope. From the outset, we have condemned the Hamas terrorist attack. We're in favour of the right of Israel to defend itself, and we've also announced that civilians cannot be made victims. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to find a solution for this humanitarian problem. Mr. Borrell, Cyprus has undertaken actions to try and open a humanitarian corridor to the Middle East. Cyprus is working on the ground, and we're in favour of the humanitarian issue being resolved. Mr. Borrell, I'm very pleased that you've supported this initiative. It's an initiative that is not just Cypriot, but European as well. Thank you.
Ich habe jetzt folgendes Problem.
Now, we have the following problem. In a few minutes, we will be having our guest speaker today, the Prime Minister of Bulgaria, who will be here in the chamber. So I would say that there are many people who've asked for the floor under Catch the Eye. I cannot take all of them. I'm obliged only to take 5, and so I have to meet the gender balance and a balance between the political groups as well. And secondly, I would call on the Council and the Commission to stick to the allocated speaking time. I'll start the Catch the Eye procedure with Ms. Janina Ochowska.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, President. I think we should strike the right balance when discussing the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Yes, we should demand that all the hostages be released. We should demand a ceasefire. We should criticize Israel for its retaliation, while condemning Hamas and other terrorist organizations. We should put an end to this terrorism. I will never forget a girl from Palestine who had a wound in her face and lost her hands. But I will never forget either the bodies of the Jews murdered by Hamas. We need a stable peace. This is starting with forgiveness and dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz-de-Vesa.
Muchas gracias, querido presidente.
Thank you very much, dear President Otmar Karas. My thanks to the High Representative and Vice President Josep Borrell and to Commissioner Lunacek. I think we should be congratulating the High Representative for his tour around the countries of the Middle East. I think it's been a very useful visit to make sure that the EU's position is clear. And I think it's also necessary to reiterate that we in the EU are against Palestine no longer controlling the Gaza Strip. The future of the Gaza Strip, or rather, we are in favor of Hamas not doing that anymore. It should be the Palestinian Authority with support of the United Nations and others, and from there on in the two-state solution. And the EU should be assessing the possibility of putting forward a European Union peace plan, as the US have in the past. I think that would give added value to the European Union if we could put forward a peace plan to support the peace process. Thank you.
Danke. Frau Abi.
Thank you very much. Ms. Abia Al-Shahani.
The floor is yours. We have no time, please. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to start with apologizing to the children of Gaza on our disappointing position so far. We have let them down. We have let their lives be taken away from them and not defended their equal right to life. And let me thank also Mr. Borrell for finally raising his voice in a just way, standing up for all humans' human rights, because if something that has been very clear and strongly shown is that we have applied double standards when it comes to implementing human rights for all. The people of Gaza, the Palestinians, have been treated with double standards, and that's just a fact. Yesterday, I listened to the Israeli former ambassador Eli Barnavi, and he said that we have to show courage. That means that we have to now start to force both sides to the peace negotiations. We have to have a Marshall Plan for Gaza, and we have to recognize the state of Palestine and bring on the Americans. Thank you.
Frau Margret Auken.
Ms. Margrethe Auken.
Thank you, Borrell, for an excellent speech. There is a point that we haven't talked about today at all, is the threat that's happening in Lebanon. 9 people were killed yesterday, 2 reporters and an old woman. 45 or 46,000 have been internally displaced. Olive trees have been cut down, and white phosphorus has been used on them. And let me quote what the Israeli Minister for Defense Gallant said. He's saying it's all over the Arab media now. What we are doing in Gaza, we can do in Beirut. I think we have to pay a lot of attention to that serious threat that might be hitting us all, because we do not see the things that are happening at the moment. Also in Beirut and in Lebanon, they have strong recollections of what they were exposed to. So we cannot guarantee that they'll just sit with their hands folded and hope that things go well. We have to be much tougher there. I know that Borrell knows this. I think we all should know that. Thank you.
Im Catch-the-Eye-Verfahren unser letzter Redner ist.
The last speaker is Mr. Ladislav Ilčić under Catch the Eye.
Poštovani kolege. Dear colleagues, you've said that Israel is killing civilians, and you've used this as an argument to condemn Israel. So each piece of news about a killed civilian thus damages Israel and is beneficial to Hamas. So it's clear why Hamas wouldn't let civilians go, but rather it uses them as a human shield. You've called for ceasefire, but during the ceasefire, Hamas will surely not sit idle. It will regroup and bring additional weapons. How come you have not called for a complete disarmament of Hamas? How come you have not called for elections in Gaza? All of you condemning Israel here today, you are protecting Hamas, you are protecting terrorism, and you are importing that terrorism into Europe. So when Israel is destroying Hamas today, it is doing a service to all of us.
Now we move to the Council and Commission for comments, turning first to Commissioner Lenarčič.
Mr. President, honourable members, I listened very carefully to all the interventions, and I would like to summarise my concluding remarks in the following 5 points. 1. There can be no doubt that the international humanitarian law applies fully in this conflict as in any other conflict, and it is binding on all parties. And it is also quite obvious that international humanitarian law is not being respected. Large numbers of civilians have been killed in Israel on 7th of October. Hostages were taken. Rockets have been fired indiscriminately across Israel. More than 12,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza. Humanitarian aid is being obstructed. More than 100 UN staff have been killed, and so on. These are violations of international humanitarian law, and they have to stop. Second, it is urgent to improve humanitarian access into Gaza and within Gaza. Now let me explain what this means in practice with the help of the UN Security Council resolution adopted last week, resolution number 2712, which says inter alia what this access means. It means, I quote, urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip for a sufficient number of days to facilitate the continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential goods and services throughout the Gaza Strip, including water, electricity, fuel, food, and medical supplies, as well as emergency repairs to essential infrastructure, and so on. This is the law. This is what the law says, and we still have not seen it complied with fully by all parties to this conflict. Third point, I also wish to stress the importance of the role of the United Nations. The role of the United Nations in humanitarian assistance to Palestinian territories is indispensable. And I want to say that very clearly because the United Nations has been attacked by some recently, and I just want to make it clear that without them there can be no meaningful humanitarian assistance to Gaza and other parts of Palestinian territory. Fourth, for us as the European Union and our member states, it is essential to step up humanitarian response, both in kind and in funding, and the European Commission is committed to doing its part. And finally, my fifth point, while our focus has been on Gaza, we should not lose sight of the deteriorating situation in the West Bank, and we should step up our efforts on the political front towards a two-state solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Vice President of the Commission and High Representative, Josep Borrell, has the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. Ya les había...
Thank you, President. As I said at the beginning, we should be able to weigh up both sides of the scales. Again, we have to say and repeat what happened on the 7th of October is something that we absolutely condemn. There is no justification for it, not in a defense against colonization settlements or to build a Palestinian state. No. It's not a question of whether the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. The 7th of October wasn't an act of defense. It was an act of terrorism. They attacked civilians in a premeditated way. And I can repeat that as many times as you want, because it seems that some people don't want to hear it. We also have to be clear that Molotov cocktails thrown against synagogues in Berlin or slogans against Jews in Sydney have nothing to do with showing solidarity with the Palestinian people. It's just the old hatred against Jewish people that was responsible for some of the worst periods in European history, and that we have to fight every single day without exception and without any doubt. Do you want me to repeat it? We can repeat it every day. But that doesn't mean we can ignore what's happening in the West Bank, settlements that are counter to UN resolutions. And it doesn't mean that we can minimize the errors that have been committed by both sides in this tragedy that's been going on for far too long. If we want to talk about laws and rights, we should listen to those who are responsible for implementing it, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Their role should not be based on emotion, but on clear, objective proof. And the ICC is carrying out the necessary investigations into what we see as a tragedy and acts against people without defense. We cannot mix up emotion and reason. Of course, emotions run very high in that part of the world, but we have to try to move beyond emotions to set out the path that we can travel together to try to search for peace. Peace cannot be built on military destruction by a terrorist organization. Peace will be built on the hope of the Palestinian people, their hope to live in liberty and dignity. Without this, there will be no peace. And peace isn't just something that we want to see for moral reasons. Today we talk about the need for virtue, but it's not just a question of virtue. It's a necessity. And Israel needs a Palestinian state more than anyone, because the best guarantee of peace and security for Israel is the existence of a Palestinian state that's written into international law and respects Israel's rights to survive. That's what we have to invest in. I don't want to get bogged down into Spanish affairs. Spanish wasn't the presidency of the European Council. It's Charles Michel who is the president of the Council. It's not the Spanish government. And they don't have, we have the presidency, the rotating presidency, but that's something quite different. The responsibility for international affairs has been transferred to the High Representative. So if you want to criticize someone, criticize me. And I've also heard your support as well as your criticism, but it's very difficult, believe me, to find the right balance when everyone feels pain and nobody wants to talk about what's going to happen in the future because everyone is focused on today, on the moment. We want to see an end to Hamas, but also an end to not to see any more deaths. But there will be a day after. And when that day comes, that's when the European Union will have a date with history. We have to contribute more, and not just to try to minimize the damage that's already happened, but we have to ensure that it doesn't happen again. My colleague Yanis was referring to the humanitarian aid that they're so admirably providing. But we also need a political commitment to ensure that this humanitarian aid is not just used to heal wounds, because it's pointless healing wounds if people will die under bombs the next day. We need humanitarian aid, but also political commitment. We need to see both. And I hope that this Parliament will actively contribute to the solutions and will be able to overcome its differences. Thank you.
Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen,
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you